Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Chian Huay. On today's program, and we begin today's show with the South China Sea issue. This week, a U.S. spy plane conducting activities over the South China Sea was monitored by the Chinese jets. The U.S. has again defended its innocence by stressing the spy plane was flying in international space. However, this was contradicted by the Chinese side, who said it was an extremely close surveillance. What can the U.S. achieve from their upgraded actions over China's sovereignty? And also we will discuss about that. But before that, let's take a look at this.
Tensions escalate further. On Tuesday, a U.S. Navy EP-3 spy plane conducted close-in spying activities near China's Hainan Island in the South China Sea. As a warning, 2 Chinese J-11 fighter jets followed it to monitor the U.S. plane. But the U.S. Defense Department criticized such action as an unsafe intercept.
2 Chinese aircraft that approached, and our aircrew felt that the approach was not conducted in the safe and professional manner, and so that's the concern that we have, and that's what's being reviewed at this time.
On Thursday, China's foreign ministry denied this statement and reaffirmed all its actions have been conducted under the law.
We received information from the department concerned, and what the U.S. side has said is untrue. 2 Chinese military airplanes followed and monitored it in accordance with laws and regulations, and also all maintained safe distance from it. China's relevant operations subscribe to professional and security standards.
Such spying flights have led to serious clashes and sunk two-way ties before. In 2001, a collision between a Chinese jet and a U.S. spy plane in the South China Sea caused the death of a Chinese pilot. In recent years, the South China Sea has turned into a hotspot for potential regional conflicts. Nonetheless, the parties tried efforts to establish certain mechanisms to prevent a crisis. In 2014, China and the U.S. signed the Rules of Behavior for the Safety of Air and Maritime Encounters as a big step to reduce conflicts. However, U.S. military warplanes and aircraft have conducted more close-in reconnaissance, frequently over the South China Sea. This has caused heightening of the uncertain situation. With an international arbitration launched unilaterally by the Philippines against China's territorial sovereignty expected within weeks, questions over the South China Sea issue continue to hang in midair.
For more on the South China Sea disputes and the recent interactions between the U.S. and the Chinese side, we are joined here in the Beijing studio by Professor Huay from the Chinese Defense University of China. Welcome, Professor. Meanwhile, in Beijing, we're having Mr. Tung, Director for the Center of Arms Control with the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome as well, sir. And in Washington, D.C., we are joined by Mr. Volker, former U.S. Ambassador to Nato and now CEO of Mccain Institute for International Leadership. Welcome as well, Ambassador Volker. Ambassador Volker, I would like to begin with you. Is it provocation, as the Chinese believes, what U.S. just did over the South China Sea?
No, I don't think so. I do think it is a serious incident where both sides need to be talking with each other. We obviously have different points of view about sovereignty issues. China claims sovereignty over parts of this sea that the U.S. does not recognize, nor do other countries in the region recognize. The U.S. takes no position, but we know it's a disputed area instead. And we both operate military aircraft and military forces in the area. We also agree on wanting to keep our forces from coming into contact with one another. We're not trying to provoke incidents from either side. And I do think it's important that we communicate about that to try to maintain as much peace and stability as possible.
We communicate. How much can we communicate? How much of those communications will be able to avoid possible clash or conflict on the site?
Yeah, I think it has been done in the past, yes.
Very briefly from you, Ambassador. It has been done in the past and can
continue to be done. Yes, you frame the issues of what you agree on and what you disagree on. There will be areas of disagreement, but you try to at least manage those to avoid actual conflict.
Ambassador Xu here in Beijing, yes, we try to do that. everybody state their opinion. It's an international practice to do that when you have conflicts. But in reality, when those two planes fly very close to one another, there's always the possibility of an accident. When accident happens, that is totally bringing the thing to another different nature. So, Professor Xu, are we playing with fire? And who is playing with fire?
I think it's really dangerous for this kind of place. Communication can play a role, and this is very important for the two sides who frequently engage in such a kind of place. But I think to the utmost, it can play a limited role in avoiding conflict between the two sides. The best bet is, I think, is try to talk and to avoid these kind of so close contact with each other. That means I think the U.S. should reduce their times to have a coastal reconnaissance to the other sovereign states. Unfortunately, the U.S. has played that kind of games during the Cold War, and they have rich experience, and they want to play the games again in this area, in China, coastal areas, and even the others.
But Professor Xian, I have to
fundamentally pose a threat to the other countries.
But I have to ask you this question, just to be fair here for the discussion. I mean, when the U.S. planes fly over, in order to make their political statements, why is it really necessary for the Chinese planes to go up there and try to intercept? Couldn't that make the things ever more dangerous?
For instance, if some guy always come to your doorsteps and try to see what happened in the inside, and you will feel quite uncomfortable. You have legitimate right to come out to say, hey, hello, keep away from our doors. So quite clear. So I think the fundamental reason for the dangers is the Americans, I said that excessive claimants of their freedom of navigation operations in other countries. And that kind of freedom operations is quite consequential. To the least, it will, create hostilities and even, mistrust between the other two countries. To the worst, it will lead to the risk of war.
All right.
By the end of the Cold War, the Americans enjoyed excessive freedom operations in anywhere in the world. But what happened? What the consequence? It led to war, and a lot of American men and women were killed in the war field.
Okay.
And no need to mention about other innocent peoples. So I think all these freedom of navigation operations should have some limits.
Okay. Well, those are, of course, voices from the military. But what about from the civilian side? Mr. Tung, for you, I mean, the militaries talk about, well, there should be political discussions and negotiations and dialogues about different kinds of political attitude toward the issue. But will dialogue in this on this issue really work? I mean, it seems that all sides have very clear views about what they believe is the ultimate political correctness, and therefore can they, in a way, be putting their feet into other shoes and think about the alternatives?
Of course, political dialogue is very important to solve such a dispute. Actually, this is dispute one of the three obstacles in the relations between China and the United States, the close surveillance to the Chinese territory. And I think why we keep such a clear-cut position against these close surveillance by the United States. Actually, this reminds us of the Cold War game played by the United States with Russia, with former Soviet Union, and they did a lot of close surveillance to the border, and there were some clashes. For example, the shooting down of the Korean airplane and for the surveillance purpose.
All right.
So I think this is a very dangerous game. I quite agree with what Professor Xu just mentioned. It's a challenge to the security of our country. For example, the surveillance plane EP-3, actually it can collect the commander's voice. It's very important. If a commander's voice can be heard during the wartime, which means you will be there.
All right.
And the missile will be followed your voice and kill the commander. So this is a very dangerous thing.
Let's just follow your logic a little bit and come back to Ambassador Volker in the U.S. Mr. Ambassador, is the United States, at least according to the logic of Mr. Tung here in Beijing, trying to regard China as the former Soviet Union, as the U.S. did during the Cold War?
No, I don't think so. I think that there's a great difference between China and the Soviet Union. We have immense trading relationship with China. We have very close economic ties. We invest in each other's countries. We have strong cultural links. China is very different from the kind of totalitarian society that the Soviet Union had tried to impose. China is not aggressively threatening other countries around the world the way the Soviet Union did during the Cold War. So there's a lot where the U.S. and China have a lot in common, a lot we can work on, yet we will still have some differences. And this is what we were talking about earlier again. It's just important to recognize when we do have differences, these can be managed peacefully, and we have to be respectful of each other's needs and positions and distance. We will come in contact. If a plane came to the U.S. coast, we would send up our fighter aircraft, but there are protocols for how we do that. China has similar protocols as well, and that's the kind of thing we could be talking about to make this safer.
Can you give us some examples, Ambassador Volker, as to what kind of protocols are you referring to? Because many of our viewers from around the world, they might not necessarily know all the technical details, but at certain times,
sure,
technical details could be extremely important.
Yeah. I'll give you a perfect illustration here. So when a military aircraft comes close to the airspace of another country, not even in the airspace, even close, international airspace, they will have on transponders that communicate who that aircraft is, what they belong to. The country that they're approaching may send up interceptors, fighter aircraft, to intercept and escort to make sure that that does not enter the territorial space of that country. There will be communication between the pilots to say, here is who we are, here is who you are, what are your intentions, and there's also a safe distance that is maintained between the aircraft to avoid sudden moves and to avoid coming into collision. China has such protocols as well. But I'll give you the example of Russia and its behavior in the Baltic Sea, where it actually switched off its transponders and came dangerously close to an American destroyer and also to an aircraft in the Baltic Sea area. Russia is deliberately flouting some of those protocols. I think with the U.S. and China, we can actually work out how to handle these things.
Will we? I mean, Professor Xu here in Beijing, coming from the military side, I'm sure China has certain protocols as well, just as Ambassador Volker mentioned. But at times when the two planes, let's just take an example, could be so close to one another, sometimes your intention does not necessarily really reflect in the actual action or realities out there. It could be influenced by so many different factors, even including the mood of those in command itself. So what do you make of those technical details? Are they really likely to solve the problem?
I'm really appreciate that your American friends know so much detail about the tactical matters they used to take or they practiced in the past. But I have to say that tactical matters can only resolve tactical issues. The U.S.-China relation is a strategic issue, and this tactical, practice of the United States of America, that sending their military aircraft and their vessels into the coastal area of China, really send a very bad signal to the Chinese people. I mean, the whole public perceive this as a very hostile, intentions and practices that will create, mistrust, and it's really is one of the major obstacles for further, improve our relations.
All right.
We have large rooms for cooperation in maintaining regional peace, provide public goods, but just due to this kind of hostility, it's hard for decision makers in the central government to make
Mr. Tung, remind me, if you can, because I'm sure you know much better than I am about the EP3 incident happened over the Hainan Island between China and the United States that really put the bilateral relations to one of the lowest points over the past few decades since the two countries established diplomatic ties. But of course, we came out of that crisis after both sides making a lot of effort, but that was regarded as an accident by the U.S. side. That was regarded with clear intention from the Chinese side. So still, we do not have same views about this specific incident. Having said that, though, can that be a lesson for both sides? What kind of mechanisms, under the current circumstances, you heard very clearly from Ambassador Volker, that's not likely to change from the U.S. side. Under the circumstances, what really can be done?
We should learn lessons from the history, especially the clash between the two militaries. For example, the Chinese fighter was lost, and the Chinese pilot also lost his life. during the clash. And actually, in recent years, the two countries have tried the best to avoid such an accidental event. For example, we have already reached at least 2 MOUs in terms of the air encountering and also the maritime encountering. This is actually a very good practice for the two countries. For example, when there is an encountering over the high sea and all the common channel, between the two militaries opened to communicate, I think quite well. So this is a good practice. But everybody knows the aircraft, in such a high speed, and any accidental behavior, action will cause
even minor.
the life or even the loss of the aircraft. So this is a really dangerous game. In terms of the response of China, I'm sure China will increase its defensive activities, especially to intercept all these surveillance aircraft very close to the Chinese territory.
Right. Well, Ambassador Volker, there are a series of events that China, and it seems that people here are taking to note. One, of course, is the so-called international arbitration against China concerning the sovereignty of some of the islands China claims in the South China Sea. That is still going on between China and the Philippines. The U.S., some say, has been playing a role behind the scenes. Other thing, for example, recently, the missile-guided destroyer of the United States near the Chinese territory, and there has been some very different views coming from China as well toward the U.S. action. And then we got the U.S. planes over the area of South China Sea. China also claims, and then the Chinese jets tried to intercept, and all of these, the interactions among the two sides, which put really into the question as to what is the U.S. intention, and is it going to be an escalation of these intentions until a political result that none of us want to see, being the two powerful nations, as some say, of the world. Ambassador Volker.
Sure, thank you. First off, I think there's 3 principles to mention. One, the U.S. doesn't take a view on the dispute between China, Vietnam, Philippines on sovereignty over issues. We recognize that there is a dispute and we don't take a position on it. That means that we do not favor, second principle, we do not favor unilateral action by any actor, whether it's Vietnam or China, to assert military dominance or control in this area because we see it as a dispute. And the third principle is what was mentioned, freedom of navigation. It's a hundreds of years old principle that in international waters, navies have the ability to access those waters, use that space, and we believe upholding that principle. So what is the U.S. intention? The U.S. intention is to live with those principles and to see that stability and peace are maintained, as has been the case ever since the end of World War II. We're looking at 60 years of peace in this respect. Nothing should change now.
All right. We talk about peace, but we also talk about the current challenges. I would like to hear quote the Chinese ambassador to the United States, who has been very vocal, of course, during his term in the U.S., Mr. Cui. Ambassador Cui recently described the current U.S.-China relationship as being, quote, another defining moment, end of quote. Ambassador Cui said that whether the two sides can make the right choices depends on 3 key factors, as he sees it: their visions of the world today, their perceptions of each other, and their will and skills to manage differences while enhancing cooperation. Earlier, of course, the 3 gentlemen here mentioned a lot about the skills, technical skills to manage the differences. But eventually, what are we looking at when China, in a way, is begin to rise and U.S. is the incumbent power? How those technical details, strategic visions, and also realities be handled? I want to hear from both of you very briefly, if you can. Professor Xu.
I want to repeat again, tactical, matters can only resolve tactical, problems. But those tactical problems really have a strategic implication. So the strategic vision of the two sides is very important. We try to define the relationship, but up to now there's no clear and definite definition of this relationship. Although we passed over several rounds of crossroads, I do hope that we can experienced with such a kind of ups and downs, it's time for China and U.S. to define the relationship for building the new major power relations.
Can we define?
Yeah, I'm sure. I quite agree with what Ambassador mentioned just now. We are defining the relationship between China and the United States. For example, in security, economy. Actually, the competition between the two sides in these two areas has been intensified. And actually, the standoff in the South China Sea is very significant, part of the defining of our relations in this regard.
Interesting. Ambassador Volker, final words from you.
Thank you, and compliments to Ambassador Cui. He's an excellent diplomat here in Washington. And I think what he uses the word defining moment, that can be seen negatively, but it can also be seen positively.
Right.
Because as some of your other guests said, we do have different strategic visions, but they are not necessarily incompatible visions. With a growing China and with a strong United States, we have a lot of shared interests. We have some shared values, some differences. And I think if we work together, we can grow together. And I think there's a possibility of this being a defining moment in a very positive sense as well.
All right. We hope many in both capitals are really on the same line with the three of you. Thank you so much. Ambassador Volker from the United States, Professor Huay, and also Dr. Tung. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Thank you. Really appreciate it.